Welcome to Beyond the Scarlet Moon. 13 souls, each one broken, twisted, damned, bound to a fate worse than death. Murderers, victims, monsters, and now prisoners, trapped within glass walls, their rage fueling a machine built for madness. But who were they before the curse? Before the blood? Before they became the 13 ghosts? Tonight, we unveil their darkest secrets, their suffering, their deaths, and the horror that still lingers in the shadows. Turn down the lights, listen closely, and remember, some spirits never rest. Billy Michaels was just your average young boy. Like so many kids, he had an obsession with cowboy movies. Billy lived for the thrill of Western films, the high-stakes duels, and the wild frontier life, spending hours pretending he was a fearless cowboy. He wore his cowboy hat, strapped on his holster, and ran around his yard with his trusty cap gun, feeling invincible. But for Billy, this was more than just a game. It was who he wanted to be. Billy wasn't just any kid with a wild imagination, though. He had a rebellious streak. Known to be stubborn and, let's be honest, a bit of a brat, he wasn't one to back down easily. Billy was used to getting his way, no matter who he crossed paths with or what he had to say. His headstrong personality made him notorious in the neighborhood, often clashing with other kids. But one day, things went too far. One of Billy's friends challenged him to a duel. This wasn't unusual for the two of them, always playing make-believe heroes and outlaws. But this time, Billy's friend brought something unexpected, something real. While Billy stood confidently, with his plastic cap gun ready to shoot, his friend aimed a real, steel-tipped arrow at him. Billy, fearless as ever, took his position. To him, this was just another game. But in a horrifying twist, his friend fired the arrow straight at him, piercing the back of his head and taking his life in an instant. After his tragic death, Billy became one of the infamous ghosts trapped in the spirit realm of 13 ghosts. His appearance, eerily frozen in time, shows him still wearing his favorite cowboy costume. But there's something terribly unsettling about him. The arrow that killed him remains lodged in his head, a grim reminder of that final game he played. Unlike the other tormented spirits, Billy doesn't attack anyone who dares to cross his path. In fact, he's known as one of the least aggressive ghosts. But don't let that fool you. He's still a child, after all. A child who was robbed of his life and his innocence. All he wants to do is play. And those who encounter him in Cyrus's haunted mansion say they can still hear his voice, repeating the same chilling phrase. I want to play. Billy's spirit, filled with the innocent desire for one last game, has made him one of the most memorable ghosts in the film. Even in death, he holds on to the identity that brought him joy, that of a young cowboy. But now, he's a tragic reminder of the thin line between reality and make-believe, a line he crossed in the worst way imaginable. Jimmy Gambino wasn't just any gambler. His life began on a path paved by misfortune and dark choices. Growing up in the early 1900s, Jimmy was the son of a compulsive gambler, a man who spent every last cent at the horse tracks, leaving little behind for his family. With a father who gambled away everything, Jimmy learned early on that luck could either be your best friend or your worst enemy. But unlike most people who run from misfortune, Jimmy was drawn to it, craving the thrill, the danger, and most of all, the promise of big wins. Jimmy's passion for gambling grew, feeding an insatiable greed. By the time he was a young man, he had clawed his way to owning his own casino. He had money, power, and status. To those around him, he was the gambler. But to Jimmy, that title came with a cost. His greed didn't go unnoticed, especially by those in the criminal underworld. When the match ended, so did Jimmy's luck. He lost everything in one night, a crushing defeat he couldn't afford. Realizing the dangerous position he was in, Jimmy tried to escape, but the mafia, they don't forgive and they certainly don't forget. Jimmy's attempt to flee was short-lived. He was found, cornered, and dragged back to face his fate. In a brutal and merciless act, the mafia and the very boxer he had bet on made an example of him. Jimmy Gambino was cut into pieces, his torso separated from his head, his remains bound in cellophane. It was a message, a brutal reminder of what happens when you cross the mob. After his body was dumped into the dark, cold waters, Jimmy didn't find peace. Instead, he became trapped in a new existence, one of agony and horror. As the torso, Jimmy's spirit is incomplete, his head severed from his body, yet lying nearby, forever screaming in eternal despair. His bound torso is a ghastly reminder of the greed and ruthless ambition that ultimately led to his demise. Unlike some of the other spirits in 13 Ghosts, the torso doesn't lash out. He is more a neutral presence than an actively hostile one, as if the pain of his violent end has consumed any urge to harm others. Perhaps in death, Jimmy finally realized the true cost of his greed. Or maybe he simply wanders in endless agony, cursed to relive that fateful night over and over again. To see Jimmy Gambino's ghost is to witness a tragedy that transcends death itself. His torso, wrapped and bound as it was in life, is a vision straight from the depths of horror. A reminder of what happens when ambition leads you down a path from which there is no return. Susan LeGros had it all. Born into wealth and privilege, she was the queen of her high school, the richest, most popular girl in town. She was the kind of girl everyone envied, admired, or feared. But beneath her polished exterior was a darker side. Susan had a habit of toying with people, especially boys, using her charm to manipulate and break their hearts without a second thought. To Susan, love was a game, and she always played to win. But on the night of her senior prom, Susan's perfect world began to unravel. Her boyfriend, Chet Walters, was the star quarterback, the kind of boy every girl wanted and every guy wanted to be. But even Chet wasn't immune to Susan's games. That night, Susan's wandering eye and careless flirtations led her to cheat on Chet with another boy, a choice that would seal her fate. Chet caught them together, and his fury was unstoppable. Humiliated and consumed by rage, he stormed out of the prom, leaving Susan behind. The next day, the boy Susan had been with was found brutally beaten to death. The small town was shocked, but the horror didn't end there. Susan had vanished without a trace. For 2 long weeks, the town searched for Susan. Parents locked their doors, classmates whispered rumors, and the police followed every lead to no avail. Then, on a grim morning, her lifeless body was discovered buried beneath the 50-yard line of the high school's football field, the very field where Chet had once been a star. Her arms were bound with ropes, a macabre reminder of the control and cruelty she had once wielded over others. The town was left reeling. Chet was arrested and convicted, but the legend of Susan LeGros didn't end there. Death, it seemed, was not enough to silence her spirit. In 13 Ghosts, Susan's ghost is forever trapped as the bound woman. She appears exactly as she was on the night of her death, still wearing her elegant prom dress, her arms bound tightly by the ropes used to end her life. But her beauty is now twisted by tragedy, her once lively charm replaced by an eerie, vengeful presence. In the film, Susan's ghost lures Bobby, the youngest member of the Kriticos family, into the mansion's dangerous basement. Her haunting figure, dressed in her blood-stained prom gown, is both a warning and a lure. Despite her tragic death, her spirit still carries the same manipulative allure she wielded in life, making her a danger to anyone who crosses her path. Unlike some of the more violent spirits in the mansion, Susan isn't driven by sheer bloodlust. Instead, her torment is rooted in the vanity and cruelty that defined her life. She is both victim and villain, a tragic figure bound by the mistakes she made and the revenge that ended her life. Was Susan's fate deserved? Or was she another victim of the darkness hidden in the hearts of those around her? The answer may depend on who you ask, but one thing is certain. Her story, like the game she once played with others, has no winners. Jean Kriticos never thought she'd become a ghost. If you had asked her what she feared most, she would have said something silly, like spiders or thunderstorms. She never feared death. She never imagined fire. She had a life, a beautiful, simple life. A husband who adored her. 2 children who made her world complete. She loved the little things. Morning coffee with Arthur, the warmth of Bobby's hand in hers, the way Kathy would roll her eyes but still hug her mother at the end of the day. It was happiness, a happiness that was about to burn away in a matter of minutes. It was Christmas Eve. The house smelled of cinnamon and pine. The tree stood proudly in the corner, covered in twinkling lights and carefully placed ornaments. Jean hummed softly as she set out cookies for Santa.
Mom, that's too many.
Kathy said with a smirk, watching her pile 6 cookies onto the plate.
You think Santa doesn't get hungry?
Jean teased, winking at her daughter.
Besides, Bobby insisted.
A small giggle came from behind the couch, where Bobby peeked out, clutching his stuffed bear.
Santa works hard. He deserves a treat,
he said matter-of-factly. Arthur chuckled from the doorway.
I think Santa might have to hit the gym after this Christmas.
Jean rolled her eyes, nudging him playfully.
Oh, hush. Let the magic last a little longer.
She didn't know that this moment, this perfect moment, would be her last. That night, the house was quiet. The children slept soundly. The fireplace crackled softly, bathing the living room in a warm glow. And then a single log rolled loose. It hit the rug. The embers caught. The flames spread so fast. Jean barely had time to react. Smoke. So much smoke. She gasped, her lungs filling with the thick, acrid air. The fire roared up the Christmas tree, swallowing the ornaments, the star, the carefully wrapped presents. She turned toward the hallway, and that's when she saw him. Arthur was already running, his eyes wild with terror.
Jean, the kids!
He bolted past her, racing for Bobby's room first. Jean hesitated for only a second, just 1 second, before turning back toward the flames. The fire had already consumed half the living room. The heat was unbearable, licking at her skin like molten fingers. But she saw it, a photograph on the mantel, their family portrait. It was stupid, she knew, but something inside her needed to save it. She lunged forward. The heat blasted against her face, her arms, her hands. She grabbed the frame, and the flames grabbed her. A sharp crack echoed through the house as the burning tree collapsed, sending sparks flying. Jean screamed. Pain! Blinding, searing pain. The fire crawled up her side, devouring her dress, melting into her skin. She stumbled, disoriented, the photograph slipping from her fingers as she collapsed to the ground. Her vision blurred. She felt the heat eating away at her, the darkness creeping in. And then Arthur's voice.
Jean, where are you?
She tried to call out, but the smoke stole her breath. She saw a shadow in the haze. Arthur. He was carrying Bobby, shielding him from the flames. Kathy was behind him, her face streaked with soot. Jean reached out. Arthur locked eyes with her, just for a moment. And then he turned. He ran toward the door, Bobby and Kathy in his arms. He thought she was behind him. He thought she was safe. He didn't see her collapse. He didn't see her burn. Jean woke up in a hospital bed. The pain was unbearable. Her skin, her body felt wrong. She tried to move, but the agony was instant, slicing through her nerves like knives. A soft beeping filled the silence. The smell of antiseptic burned her nose. She turned her head slightly and saw Arthur sitting beside her, his face buried in his hands.
Arthur.
She croaked. He looked up instantly, his eyes wide, red-rimmed. Tears fell onto her bandaged skin. She asked how the kids are.
They're safe. They're safe because of you.
His voice broke. Relief washed over her, but it was drowned by the exhaustion creeping into her bones. She knew. Even as Arthur begged the doctors for hope, even as Kathy and Bobby whispered "Mommy" in small, shaky voices, she knew. She wasn't going home, so she used her last breath to whisper,
I love you.
And then darkness. But death was not the end. She woke again. Not in the hospital, not in heaven, but somewhere in between. She wandered the world unseen, watching her family grieve, watching them struggle. And then, one day, Arthur stepped into the house of Cyrus Kriticos. Jean felt something shift. She was pulled toward the mansion, toward the cursed, twisted labyrinth of glass and shadows. She was trapped, a prisoner in Cyrus' collection. But she didn't care, because Arthur was there. Her children were there, and she would do what she had always done. She would protect them, even in death, even as her burned, withered body lingered in the halls of the damned. She was still their mother. And love never dies. In the 1950s, Royce Clayton wasn't just any teenager. He was a baseball prodigy, the kind of athlete every coach dreams of having on their team. With his effortless swing and uncanny precision, Royce became a local legend. His skills on the diamond didn't just bring his team glory. They also caught the attention of college scouts across the country. To his family and friends, Royce seemed destined for greatness, a golden boy who could do no wrong. But talent and fame often come with their own pitfalls. Royce had a taste for danger, and his success on the field only fueled his need to prove himself off it. When he wasn't hitting home runs, Royce was racing cars. Drag races became his second passion, a dangerous game of speed and ego where reputations were built and destroyed in the blink of an eye. One fateful night, Royce accepted a challenge from a local greaser known for his reckless antics. It was supposed to be just another race, another chance for Royce to show the world he was invincible. But his challenger had other plans. Unbeknownst to Royce, the greaser had tampered with his car, cutting the brake lines. As the race reached its climax, Royce realized too late that he couldn't stop. The car spun out of control, crashing in a fiery wreck. The once promising star of the baseball diamond was gone in an instant. Royce's untimely death sent shockwaves through his small town. The boy who seemed destined for greatness had been reduced to another tragic headline. Royce was laid to rest in a small plot overlooking a baseball diamond, a haunting reminder of the bright future that would never be. But death didn't silence Royce entirely. In 13 Ghosts, his spirit is forever known as the Torn Prince. Dressed in his baseball uniform, he appears clutching the bat that once symbolized his talent and promise. The Torn Prince is a tragic and dangerous presence. His ghost bears the scars of his fatal crash, his once handsome face now marred and twisted. He is consumed by anger, a restless spirit trapped by the betrayal and untimely end he suffered. Unlike some of the other ghosts in 13 Ghosts, the Torn Prince is not a neutral entity. His rage makes him unpredictable and violent, striking out at anyone who crosses his path. Even in death, Royce carries his baseball bat. But now, it's not a tool of sport. It's a weapon, a symbol of his wrath. In the Kriticos mansion, the Torn Prince prowls the halls, his presence signaled by the faint sound of scraping metal and the crack of a bat against an unseen ball. To encounter him is to face the fury of a dream cut short. But beneath the rage and violence, there's a deeper tragedy. Royce Clayton's story is one of potential wasted, of a life stolen before it had the chance to truly begin. He is a reminder of how fleeting success can be and how easily it can be derailed by one reckless moment. His spirit remains tethered to the baseball diamond, a shadow of the bright young man he once was. Was Royce's death the result of arrogance, or was he simply another victim of someone else's jealousy and malice? The answer may never be clear, but one thing is certain. His story, like his spirit, refuses to fade into the past. In life, Dana Newman was a woman of extraordinary beauty, turning heads wherever she went. To the outside world, she had it all: grace, elegance, and a face that seemed sculpted by the gods themselves. But as we often learn, appearances can be deceiving. Beneath her flawless exterior lay a heart riddled with pain, self-doubt, and an unrelenting inner critic. Dana was a perfectionist, a trait often attributed to her zodiac sign, Virgo. But for her, perfection wasn't just a goal. It was an obsession. She became trapped in a cruel cycle, unable to see the beauty that everyone else saw in her. Her mirror didn't reflect admiration. It reflected her deepest insecurities. Every glance at her reflection whispered lies, telling her she wasn't enough. Her insecurities were only exacerbated by the men in her life. Boyfriend after boyfriend chipped away at her fragile self-esteem with cruel words and impossible expectations. Desperate for their approval and for a version of herself she thought she needed to be, Dana turned to the world of cosmetic surgery. She believed that if she could sculpt her body to perfection, the voices of inadequacy would finally fall silent. Dana began working for a plastic surgeon, and her payment came not in cash but in surgeries, breast implants, nose jobs, and a growing list of other procedures turned her body into a canvas for her obsession. But no matter how many surgeries she underwent, she could never see what others did. Her beauty became a prison, one she thought she could escape with just one more procedure. One fateful night, Dana's inner demons led her to a decision she would never come back from. Alone in the clinic, her mind racing with self-loathing, she decided to take matters into her own hands. An imaginary imperfection, something no one else could see, drove her to attempt surgery on herself. But the procedure went horribly wrong. Instead of erasing her perceived flaw, Dana left herself blinded in one eye. The mirror that had once been her enemy now became her tormentor. Looking at her reflection, Dana saw not the world's most beautiful woman, but a monster of her own creation. Consumed by despair, she couldn't bear to live another day in her own skin. Dana retreated to her bathroom, filled the tub with water, and ended her life in an act of tragic finality. When her lifeless body was discovered, even in death, she was hauntingly beautiful. But beauty alone couldn't mask the sorrow that had consumed her soul. As Cyrus, the architect of the Black Zodiac, would later describe her, she was as beautiful in death as she was in life. But death was not the end of Dana's story. Her spirit, twisted by years of self-loathing and the violent act of her death, returned as the angry princess. Trapped in the spectral plane, she became a vengeful and tormented soul. Her ghostly form reflects her tragic demise. Her pale skin is marred with self-inflicted scars, her empty eyes echoing the pain that drove her to such a tragic end. She roams the halls of her eternal prison, clutching the same knife she used to end her mortal suffering, a chilling reminder of her final moments. Her rage and envy are palpable. In the film 13 Ghosts, Dana's anger is especially directed toward Kathy, a young woman whose natural beauty reminds her of everything she once had and everything she believed she lost. Dana's ghost becomes a terrifying warning of what happens when insecurities go unchecked and beauty becomes a weapon rather than a gift. But her wrath isn't reserved solely for Kathy. When Ben Moss, the lawyer who embodies greed and lust, mocks her with a lewd comment, Dana's revenge is swift and brutal. Moments later, he is sliced in half by a sliding glass door, a fitting end orchestrated, one might believe, by the angry princess herself. So, the next time you catch your reflection in the mirror, think of Dana Newman. Think of the angry princess. And remember, perfection is an illusion, one that can turn deadly if you let it consume you. Isabella Smith's story begins with hope. Orphaned at a young age, she left behind her troubled past in Europe to seek a new life in the New World. Alone and vulnerable, she arrived in a small, tight-knit New England colony, a place that promised freedom but often delivered judgment to those who didn't conform. Isabella was an outsider, her accent unfamiliar, her ways different. The townsfolk were suspicious of her from the moment she stepped foot in their community. Life in the colony was harsh, but Isabella worked tirelessly to carve out a place for herself. She planted crops, tended to her animals, and sought acceptance among the people who regarded her with wary eyes. Yet no matter how hard she tried, whispers followed her everywhere. She's too quiet, they would say. Too strange. Fear and paranoia are powerful forces, and for Isabella, they would soon become a death sentence. One day, a mysterious illness struck the town's livestock. Overnight, the animals began to die, their bodies writhing in pain before succumbing to the unknown ailment. The town was thrown into chaos. Crops failed, bellies went empty, and desperation set in. And in desperate times, people often look for someone to blame. The local preacher, a man whose sermons were as fiery as the torches the town would soon wield, pointed his finger at Isabella. He claimed her arrival had cursed the colony and that her presence alone had angered God. "She's a witch," he declared, his voice booming through the church. The townsfolk, already on edge, latched onto his words. They were eager for a scapegoat, and Isabella fit the role perfectly. Despite her desperate pleas of innocence, the accusations against her only grew stronger. Fear turned to frenzy. Days later, the preacher himself fell gravely ill. He collapsed in the middle of a sermon, writhing and foaming at the mouth. To the superstitious townsfolk, this was proof. Isabella was a witch, and she had cursed him. Consumed by panic, the town rallied together, torches in hand, to hunt Isabella down. They found her hiding in a barn, trembling and terrified. Without hesitation, they set the barn ablaze, convinced that the fire would rid them of the supposed witch. But what happened next only deepened their fear. As the flames consumed the barn, Isabella emerged from the inferno unscathed. Her dress was untouched by the fire, her skin unmarred. To the townsfolk, this was no miracle. It was evidence of her unholy powers. They captured her and dragged her to the center of town, where they sentenced her to a fate worse than death. Isabella was placed in the stocks, a cruel and humiliating punishment that left her vulnerable to the townsfolk's wrath. Children threw stones at her, adults spat on her and hurled curses. Day after day, Isabella endured their hatred, her body growing weaker as starvation set in. Yet she never once confessed to the crime of witchcraft. She maintained her innocence until the very end, though her voice grew fainter with each passing day. After weeks of torment, Isabella's body finally gave out. She died alone, her spirit weighed down by the cruelty and injustice she had suffered. The townsfolk buried her in an unmarked grave, hoping to erase her from memory. But some tragedies refused to stay buried. Whether or not Isabella was truly a witch remains a mystery. Even Cyrus, the mastermind behind the Black Zodiac, could not confirm it. But her suffering, her unjust death, and the rage born of her torment made her a perfect candidate for his twisted collection. In death, Isabella became the Pilgrimess, a spirit of vengeance and sorrow. Her spectral form is as haunting as her tale. She appears in her tattered dress, her face a mask of anguish, her eyes filled with the pain of betrayal. Her presence is cold, her energy vengeful, and those who encounter her often feel the weight of her suffering pressing down on their souls. The Pilgrimess embodies the dark side of Libra, the scales of justice tipped into imbalance. She is unreliable, impatient, emotionally detached, and vindictive, a twisted reflection of the fairness and harmony her zodiac sign is meant to represent. Her story serves as a chilling reminder of the consequences of fear, ignorance, and the unchecked power of mob mentality. So, the next time you hear the whispers of history or feel the weight of judgment, think of Isabella Smith. Think of the Pilgrimess. And remember, the truth isn't always what it seems, and the past has a way of haunting those who refuse to learn from it. In the dark and twisted world of the Black Zodiac, there are few spirits as tragic or as grotesquely terrifying as the Great Child and the Dire Mother. Their story begins with Margaret Shelburne, a woman cursed by the cruelty of the world. Born a little person, she was ridiculed, cast aside, and forced into the only life that would accept her, a traveling carnival, where she became a sideshow attraction. But her small stature didn't make her weak. No, Margaret possessed a strength fueled by bitterness, loneliness, and desperation. One fateful night, Margaret was attacked by a towering brute known only as the tall man the crime left her with a child, a son she named Harold. Unlike his mother, Harold was born enormous, towering over other children even as a baby. He was an oddity, a spectacle, and in the twisted world of the carnival, oddities were never left in peace. Margaret, broken by her past and terrified of the world, smothered her son in love and obsession. She treated him like a helpless infant, refusing to let him grow up. She bathed him, dressed him, even spoon-fed him, all while whispering how special he was, how cruel the world could be, how only she would ever protect him. Harold, in turn, became completely dependent on her, never learning to care for himself, never escaping her suffocating grasp. The other performers mocked them relentlessly. Whispers turned to taunts, taunts turned to cruelty. Grown men would laugh at Harold as he waddled about in oversized diapers, while Margaret would be spat on and called a freak. But Margaret never wavered in her devotion, shielding Harold from the hate, even as it festered inside of him, turning into something dark. Then one night, the carnies took their torment too far. A cruel joke, a punishment for being different. They kidnapped Margaret, shoving her into a small burlap sack and tossing her aside like trash. They never meant for her to die, but when Harold found her, the air in her fragile lungs had already run out. His mother was gone, and something inside him snapped. What happened next became carnival legend. Harold rampaged through the grounds, an axe in his massive hands. His mother's lifeless body left in the dirt. One by one, he hunted them down, the laughing men, the taunting women, the jeering children. He cut them apart, leaving their mangled corpses on display, turning the carnival into a grotesque exhibition of revenge. The massacre left the carnival owner, a man named Jimbo, with only one option. He gathered a mob, angry, bloodthirsty, seeking justice. They descended upon Harold, cornering him, beating him, hacking at his flesh. He never stood a chance. When it was over, his broken body was tossed alongside his mother's. But death did not grant them peace. Their bond was too strong, their rage too great. And when Cyrus came looking for lost souls to complete the Black Zodiac, their vengeful spirits answered his call. Now, the great child and the dire mother haunt the corridors of the afterlife. Margaret, whispering words of comfort to her child, and Harold, still wearing his soiled diaper, still searching for the ones who wronged them, still clutching his blood-stained axe. If you ever hear the wheeze of a woman's soft cries, or the heavy footsteps of something massive approaching, run. Because no joke, no taunt, no cruelty goes unpunished in death. In the late 1800s, in a small, sun-scorched town where justice was a privilege reserved for the powerful, there lived a man named George Markley. He was a blacksmith by trade, a man of unwavering strength and quiet dignity. His broad shoulders bore the weight of his craft, forging iron and steel with the patience of an artist. But despite his hard work, despite the sweat and blood he poured into his forge, George was never truly accepted by the townspeople. Because George Markley was a black man, and in a town ruled by prejudice and fear, that alone made him a target. One day, a powerful landowner named Nathan Hardesty accused George of theft. There was no proof, no witnesses, just a lie whispered into the ears of those who were all too eager to believe the worst. Nathan was a cruel man, one who saw himself above others, and he hated the fact that George refused to bow before him.
You best be leaving, Markley. Ain't no place for the likes of you here.
Nathan sneered, his voice oozing with malice. But George refused.
This is my home.
He said, his deep voice steady.
I built my shop with my own hands. My family belongs here just as much as yours does.
That defiance would cost him everything. That night, while George was in his forge, shaping iron beneath the fiery glow of his furnace, they came for his family. A mob of men who had once smiled in his presence, men who had once bought his tools and called him a good worker. They dragged his wife and children from their beds, their screams swallowed by the cold night. When George found them, it was too late. Their bodies hung from the old oak tree at the edge of town, their lifeless eyes frozen in terror. His wife, his children, gone. Something inside George Markley broke that night. The kind-hearted blacksmith who once crafted tools for the townspeople was gone. What remained was a man consumed by rage, sorrow, and vengeance. He tracked down every single one of them, the men who had taken his family, the ones who had stood by and done nothing. And one by one, he made them pay. The first to die was Nathan Hardesty. George found him drunk in his parlor, boasting to his friends about putting that blacksmith in his place. The room fell silent when they saw the hulking figure standing in the doorway, his eyes dark as coal, his massive sledgehammer gripped tightly in his calloused hands. Nathan barely had time to scream before George brought the hammer down upon his skull. The others tried to run. It didn't matter. He found them all. He shattered bones, crushed limbs, painted the walls red with their sins. And when it was done, when the last of them had breathed their final breath, George stood in the center of the blood-soaked floor, his hammer slick with vengeance. But justice was not his to take, not in the eyes of the town. The next morning, another mob formed. This time, George was the hunted. They dragged him from his forge, ignoring his cries for mercy, ignoring the truth of what they had done to him. They tied him to the very same tree where his family had been murdered, and then they took his own hammer and nailed him to it. Railroad spikes driven through his arms, his legs, his chest. Each strike of the hammer sent waves of agony through his body. But George did not scream. He refused to give them the satisfaction. But the worst was yet to come. In a final act of cruelty, they severed his right hand, the very hand that had built, created, and provided for his family. And in its place, they fused his own sledgehammer to the bloody stump. Then they left him there to die. No burial, no final rites, just another warning to those who dared to defy the rules of the wicked. But some spirits do not rest. George Markley became the hammer. His soul, twisted by betrayal and pain, now roams the earth as a spirit of vengeance. his flesh burned away, his hammer hand dripping with the blood of the guilty. When he was alive, he sought only peace and fairness. In death, he is relentless, unforgiving, unstoppable. And if you should ever find yourself alone in the dead of night, listening to the sound of metal dragging against the pavement, beware. It may not be the wind. It may be the hammer. Born in darkness, raised in blood. He was born in 1887, a bastard child to a woman who barely knew his name, a prostitute who saw him as nothing more than an unfortunate consequence of her trade. And Ryan? He hated her for it. She was never a mother to him, never even human in his eyes. Just another thing, a weak, desperate creature to be used. Maybe his mind was already cracked from the start. Maybe it was the streets that made him into a monster. Or maybe Ryan was never meant to be anything but a monster. By the time he was a man, his urges had become a need. Not for love, not for pleasure, but for control, for fear, for power. He had a preference. He liked them alone. Vulnerable. Women who walked home at night, their footsteps soft against the cobblestones, unaware they were being watched. His breath would quicken. His pulse would race. He would wait until they were just steps from safety, and then he struck. They never stood a chance.
Please, please don't do this.
They'd scream. Some fought. Some begged. And some just wept, knowing it wouldn't matter. When he was done with them, he made sure they never told their story. One woman, then another, and another. The city whispered of a predator lurking in the alleys. Women clutched their coats tighter, walked faster, never strayed too far from the gaslights. But it didn't matter, because he was faster, because he was the dark, because he was the Jackal. And still, he knew he was a monster. Maybe that's why one day, in an act that no one understood, he walked into Bournewood Asylum and committed himself. Was it guilt? A game? A way to feel power over even the doctors who sought to cure him? No one knew, but Bournewood was not salvation. It was a prison, a hell, and within its walls, monsters were made. At first, Ryan played the part of a remorseful man seeking redemption.
I don't want to be this way.
He'd say, his voice smooth, his smile disarming. And the doctors? They believed him. But at night, in the dark, he watched. He memorized the scent of the nurse's perfume, the way their fingers trembled as they handed him his medicine. He imagined what it would feel like to tear their throats out. And then, one night, one unlucky nurse stepped too close. She never walked out. The orderlies found her twisted body in the corner of Ryan's cell, her throat shredded, her eyes wide and empty. And Ryan? He was sitting in the middle of the room, laughing. That was it. No more kindness. No more prayers. No more treatment. Ryan Kuhn was declared criminally insane. Beyond saving. Beyond human. They bound him into a straitjacket so tight his bones cracked beneath the pressure. He would shriek, thrashing, writhing, fighting until his arms twisted, until his fingers curled into claws. Every time he lashed out, they tightened it more. Again, and again, and again, until his body deformed, until the pain became so unbearable. He could no longer sleep, no longer think. And when he realized the jacket would never come off, he bit into it. He ripped at it with his teeth, gnawed until his gums bled, until his mouth was torn open at the corners. That was when the doctors made their final decision. The straitjacket wasn't enough. They needed something stronger, something permanent. So they built him a cage. A rusted iron muzzle, bolted into place around his head. The moment they locked it, Ryan screamed so loud the entire asylum heard it. But it didn't matter. Because from that moment on, Ryan Kuhn no longer existed. Now, he was just an animal, locked in the basement, in total darkness, thrashing and shrieking like something born of nightmares. And then, one night, the fire came. The patients screamed. The doctors ran. But Ryan? Ryan stayed. He stood in his cell, watching the flames creep toward him, and he laughed. Because he knew something the others didn't. Death wasn't the end, and when the fire consumed him, his soul remained. The Jackal was unleashed. Years have passed, and then Cyrus Kriticos came looking. He wanted the worst, the most damned, the irredeemable, and deep in the ruins of the asylum, he found the Jackal. Now, he prowls the halls of the Kriticos mansion, a jagged, twisted figure, his head jerking unnaturally, his cage rattling as he screeches like a rabid beast. And if you see him, if you hear the scraping of metal on stone, it's already too late, because the Jackal does not haunt. He hunts. Some spirits are bound by chains, others by fire. But the Jackal? He is bound by nothing. Horace Mahoney was a mistake. A child born into a world that never wanted him. He took his first breath in a dark, filthy alley behind a brothel, his mother's body still trembling from labor. She never held him, never kissed his forehead. She barely even looked at him, because when she did, all she saw was a monster. He was too big, too grotesque. His limbs, his face wrong. So she did what she thought was merciful. She left him there in the cold, alone. But fate wasn't kind. Horace survived. He was found by his father, if you could even call him that. A mean, bitter man who saw nothing but a useful tool. He never called Horace son, never hugged him, never loved him. Instead, he put him to work. The Mahoney junkyard was a graveyard of twisted steel and broken machines, a place where things went to die, and Horace fit in perfectly. By the time he was 10, he was stronger than most grown men. By 15, he could lift an engine block without breaking a sweat. But no matter how hard he worked, no matter how much he bled, he was never good enough. His father called him an animal, a freak, a mistake, and eventually Horace started to believe it. The junkyard became his cage, the scrap metal his walls, his only company, the pack of starving dogs that roamed between the rusting cars. Years passed. His father grew older, weaker, until one day he was gone. Just like that, Horace was alone, and something inside him snapped. He didn't cry, didn't grieve. Instead, he laughed, because for the first time in his life, he was free. But freedom meant nothing when the world refused to accept you. When every face turned in disgust. When whispers followed you down the street. They feared him. And fear breeds monsters. It started with a girl. She was lost. A hitchhiker stranded on the highway. She knocked on the junkyard gates, hoping for kindness. Instead, she found him. Horace let her in. He smiled. He played the part of a gentle giant. Then he tore her apart, ripped her limb from limb with his bare hands. And when he was done, he fed the scraps to the dogs. Her screams faded into the scrapyard's endless silence, buried beneath rust and oil. And Horace? He had never felt so alive. One girl became 2, then 3, each one lost, each one trusting, each one reduced to nothing but meat. The whispers grew. People vanished. The police searched. But no one suspected the gentle giant who lived alone in the junkyard. Until one day, he picked the wrong victim. She was pretty, smart, a little nervous when she stepped through the gates. But Horace didn't know. She wasn't just a girl. She was a cop, an undercover officer investigating the disappearances. And before Horace could finish what he started, she pulled a gun from her coat and called for backup. The SWAT team swarmed the junkyard like a pack of wolves, their rifles aimed, their voices sharp.
Horace Mahoney, put your hands where we can see them.
But Horace just smiled, because no cage had ever held him. No chain had ever tamed him, and no man could ever stop him. With a roar, he snapped the cuffs like twigs and lunged. The first officer died screaming, his spine crushed in a bear-like grip. The second had his throat ripped open with nothing but Horace's teeth. The third, he never even had time to fire. Blood painted the rusted cars. Bones snapped like dry twigs. And for a moment, just a moment, it seemed like the breaker might win. But even a beast cannot fight forever. The bullets came in a hailstorm of metal and fire. 1, 2, 5, 10. Horace stumbled. He dropped to his knees, but he did not fall, even as blood poured from his wounds, even as his strength drained away. He still fought. So they shot him again, and again, and again, until finally he stayed down. And to be sure, they emptied one last clip into his lifeless body, just to make sure the monster was really dead. But monsters? They don't stay dead. The junkyard should have been silent, but after the police left, the wind began to howl, and the legend of the breaker lived on. For years, his ghost prowled the twisted remains of the cars, waiting for anyone foolish enough to step inside his domain. And when they did, he ripped them apart. Death changed nothing. He was still hunting, still hungry, still unstoppable. And then Cyrus Kriticos came looking. He had a plan, a machine, and to power it, he needed the worst souls the world had ever seen. So he lured the Juggernaut with blood, with whispers, with Latin prayers that made the very air tremble. And when the time was right, he caught him, but not before the Juggernaut took his pound of flesh. Bodies littered the junkyard. Blood soaked the dirt. And now he was caged again, bound in steel and glass, forced to wait in the basement of a house built on sin. Until the doors opened, until the machine whispered, until the hunt began again. "13 souls, each one claimed by death. But even in the afterlife, their pain remains. Their stories have been told. But does that mean they are finally free? Or are they still out there, watching, waiting for the next soul to join them?" Thank you for listening to Beyond the Scarlet Moon. If you enjoy the darkness, the hauntings, and the unknown, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. And please join me again for the next tale that waits in the shadows. Because sometimes the dead don't stay dead. Until next time, stay safe.